Imagine this. You're standing on the edge of a cliff, hundreds of feet above the ground. The wind howls in your ears, not just outside, but inside your mind. Below, nothing but an endless expanse of uncertainty. Behind you, the life you've known, safe, repetitive, none. In front of you, the unknown, the wild, the terrifying, but also freedom. You feel your body tense. Your heart beats like a war drum. You think of stepping back, of retreating into what you know. But a quieter thought whispers beneath the panic. What if I jumped not to fall, but to fly? Fear grips you, not fear of falling, but something deeper. The fear of becoming who you could be. The fear of abandoning the familiar mask you've worn for years. The fear of walking away from society's applause. Of defying expectations, of owning your existence without apology. But what if this fear, this tightening around your soul, was not something to avoid, but the very compass pointing toward freedom? Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "What if a demon were to creep after you one night, in your loneliest solitude, and say to you, 'This life as you now live it, and have lived it, you will have to live once more, and innumerable times more.' Would you fall to your knees in despair or rise in defiance?" This is the paradox of fear. It masquerades as protection, yet imprisons us in repetition. It convinces us that survival is more important than authenticity, that comfort is better than truth, that to be loved, we must first be small. You felt it, that moment where you bit your tongue instead of speaking truth. That opportunity you let pass because failure loomed larger than possibility. That conversation where you smiled, nodding, knowing the words weren't yours. And yet, beneath all of it, a pulse, a quiet rebellion, a hunger not just to live, but to live without fear. But what does that even mean? Does it mean recklessness, arrogance, the absence of anxiety? No, Nietzsche didn't preach fearlessness as naivete. He didn't want you to become numb to life. He wanted you to burn in it, to choose it. He spoke of becoming the Übermensch, the one who creates their own values, who laughs in the face of fate, who dances on the grave of comfort. And that kind of courage, it requires more than strength. It requires a death, the death of denial, the death of the self that lives only for validation. Nietzsche's secret to living without fear isn't a motivational slogan. It's a confrontation with everything you've been running from: mediocrity, conformity, and the unbearable truth that no one is coming to save you. So now, standing on that psychological cliff, the question isn't whether you're afraid. The question is, what will you do with that fear? Will you continue constructing a life shaped by avoidance, curated by approval, sanitized by safety? Or will you dare to see fear not as the enemy, but as a doorway? What if fear is the test that reveals your limits, so you can break them? What if fear is not your jailer, but your initiation? This is where Nietzsche begins, not with bravado, but with a challenge, a question that must haunt you before it can free you. What if your greatest fear is the life you're already living? And if so, how do you break free? Let's go deeper. The reason fear grips you so tightly isn't simply because the world is dangerous. It's because you've been trained to believe you are not enough to face it. From childhood, the world begins to shape you softly at first, then violently. You are rewarded for obedience, punished for defiance. You are applauded for fitting in, shamed for standing out. Over time, you begin to outsource your sense of safety, worth, and reality to external forces: parents, teachers, lovers, institutions. You stop asking, "Is this true?" and instead ask, "Will they approve?" Nietzsche saw this clearly. He called it the morality of the herd. Society, he argued, is terrified of the truly free individual because they cannot be controlled. So it builds invisible cages made of comfort, convenience, and conformity. It turns fear into a tool not of survival, but of submission. You've likely felt it. That discomfort when you say something unpopular, that hesitation before making an unconventional choice, that nagging feeling that maybe you're too much or not enough. These aren't just personal insecurities. They are social implants, psychological conditioning, subtle mechanisms of fear meant to keep you predictable, Carl Jung would later call these buried conflicts the shadow parts of ourselves: boldness, anger, sexuality, creativity, defiance that we learn to repress because they threaten the image we've been taught to project. And every time we silence the shadow, we amplify fear. Why? Because we fear ourselves, our own power, our own chaos, our own truth. Nietzsche didn't offer easy answers. He offered a mirror. He didn't say, "Do not fear." He said, "Become someone who no longer needs to be ruled by it." In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he introduces a character called the rope dancer, walking a tightrope between who he was and who he must become. Beneath him, the crowd mocks. Above him, the abyss waits. But his task is clear: to cross or to fall. That is life. There is no path without risk, no transformation without terror. And yet we wait for clarity, for approval, for perfect timing. We mistake paralysis for safety. But Nietzsche argued that safety is often a slow death, a comfortable, numbing erosion of the soul. And where does this fear come from? At its core, from a failure to affirm life as it is, not as we wish it to be, but in all its chaos, pain, and unpredictability. Nietzsche called this the doctrine of Amor Fati, the love of fate. Not mere acceptance, but love of the events that shape us, including the tragic ones, the ones we fear, the ones we run from. To live without fear is to say, let it come. Let life bring what it will. I will not hide. I will become. But modern society whispers the opposite. It tells you to numb discomfort with convenience, to replace self-knowledge with endless consumption, to fill your time so completely that introspection becomes impossible. And worst of all, it tells you that fear is a signal to retreat. Nietzsche believed fear was a signal to awaken. When we feel fear, especially in the face of change, confrontation, or authenticity, it is a signal that we are approaching the boundary of our current self. It is the heat before the transformation, the tension before the leap. But instead of leaping, most shrink. Why? Because our psychology is wired to associate the unknown with death. Evolutionarily, the unfamiliar once meant danger. But now, in the modern world, that same instinct is hijacked. Instead of physical threats, we fear being misunderstood, being rejected, being seen too clearly. And so we build lives of quiet fear. We take jobs we hate. We stay in relationships that deaden us. We follow belief systems that no longer fit, all to avoid the confrontation Nietzsche demanded, a confrontation with ourselves. He once said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow." But if your why is built on avoiding discomfort, fear becomes your master. If your why is to preserve the illusion of security, you will live a domesticated life, a life that never truly begins. And here lies the hidden problem. You are not taught how to suffer well. You were taught to escape pain, not to mine it for meaning. You were taught to silence fear, not to transmute it into power. But Nietzsche knew that fear is not the enemy. Cowardice is. Fear can be transcended. Cowardice is the decision to stay small, to betray yourself in exchange for false peace. So, the real question is not, how do I get rid of fear? It is, who must I become so that fear no longer decides the course of my life? And to answer that, you must first understand the invisible cost of your current fear. Not the dramatic moments, but the small, daily betrayals. The things you don't say. The truths you don't live. The dreams you quietly bury. This isn't just emotional. It's existential. Because the longer you wait to confront your fear, the more your life begins to shrink around it, until one day, you look around and realize you've built a prison out of your own avoidance. So, what happens when fear isn't faced? Let's take a look at what it truly costs. You think you're avoiding danger, but you're avoiding life. You wake up each morning to an alarm, not because you're alive with purpose, but because routine has replaced meaning. You scroll, sip, commute, respond. You play the part, and all the while, fear hides behind the mask of normalcy. It whispers through your inaction, guides your compromises, fuels your anxiety. It becomes so familiar you no longer notice it. But it's there, in every decision you do, every truth you silence, every dream you dismiss as unrealistic. This is the unseen consequence. Fear does not always roar. Sometimes it erodes quietly, persistently, and over time. It reshapes your entire reality not with grand catastrophes, but with micro-abandonments. You don't just lose your courage, you lose yourself. And the worst part, the world rewards it. The world applauds your conformity, your restraint, your predictability. It labels fear as wisdom, maturity, or realism. But underneath, you're not grounded, you're caged. You aren't secure, you're sedated. And every time you choose safety over soul, fear grows stronger. From a psychological standpoint, this isn't just existential, it's biological. Your brain is wired to avoid pain. The amygdala, responsible for processing fear, activates the moment you perceive threat, even a perceived threat to your identity. That's why expressing a controversial opinion can feel like physical danger. Why walking away from a toxic relationship can feel more terrifying than staying in it. Why quitting a soul-draining job might send your nervous system into a spiral. We are neurologically addicted to the familiar even when the familiar is killing us. This is how fear becomes a system, a loop. You fear change, so you don't act. So your environment doesn't change. So your fear is reinforced. And slowly, the unknown becomes monstrous in your imagination. Risk becomes synonymous with ruin. And instead of expanding your life, you spend your energy just maintaining its shrinking edges. Nietzsche knew this loop well. He called it slave morality, state where people define themselves not by who they are, but by what they avoid, where goodness is obedience, where evil is mere defiance, where fear is internalized until the individual forgets they ever had power to begin with. But there's another consequence, one far more subtle. You begin to resent those who live freely. Have you noticed it? That pang of judgment when someone breaks the mold, lies loudly, speaks truth, quits the job, leaves the relationship, dances on their own terms. That discomfort you feel, it's not really about them. It's about the part of you that died quietly to avoid that very leap. And so fear breeds not only limitation but bitterness, jealousy, projection. You begin to rationalize your choices not as survival, but as virtue. You turn your fear into a philosophy. You convince yourself that you're being wise, responsible, selfless. But deep down, a quiet voice still asks, what if I'm just scared? Philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre warned of this too. He called it bad faith, the act of lying to oneself, to avoid the responsibility of freedom. And it's a seductive lie, because once you accept it, you no longer have to confront your potential. You can blame society, your past, your circumstances. You can remain a spectator of life, rather than a creator of it. But there's a cost, a slow, internal decay. Gabor Mate, in his work on trauma and addiction, observed that people don't just suffer from what happened to them, but from the truths they've had to suppress in order to survive. And what is fear, if not the chronic suppression of truth? So you numb, not just with substances, but with screens, with noise, with endless to-do lists. You fill your days with distraction, not because you're too busy, but because you're too afraid to sit in silence with the life you've built. Because you might have to ask, is this really me? Or is this just who I've become out of fear? This is the unseen price. Not just missed opportunities, but fractured identity. Not just avoidance, but spiritual starvation. And here's the paradox. The longer you wait to confront fear, the more it mutates. What was once a simple choice, speak or stay silent, leap or stay safe, becomes an entire worldview. Fear becomes embedded not just in your actions, but in your sense of what's possible. You don't just avoid fear, you become it. And yet, buried beneath the paralysis, a seed remains, a memory, a flicker, and knowing you were meant for more. Not more possessions, not more applause, but more life, more truth, more realness. That seed is what Nietzsche called the will to power, not power over others, but power over your own becoming, a creative, evolutionary force The part of you that still longs to climb, to become, to transcend. The part of you that still knows. The cliff is not your prison, but your proving ground. But how do you reclaim it? How do you break the loop, confront fear, and reclaim authorship over your own life? It doesn't begin with a battle cry. It begins with a rebellion. It begins not with a scream, but with a whisper. You're alone. At night, the world has gone quiet, and for the first time in weeks or maybe years you let yourself stop. Not to sleep, not to scroll, but to listen. There's a hum beneath your thoughts, a pulse behind your pain. It's not fear, it's not anxiety, it's you, still alive, still waiting. That's the beginning of the rebellion. Nietzsche didn't believe that fear could be eliminated. He believed it could be transcended, transformed, from a force of paralysis into a catalyst for growth. But to do that, you must confront the truth. You've been trained to fear fear itself, conditioned to believe that discomfort is dangerous, that uncertainty equals chaos, that to be safe is to be good. But safety isn't virtue. It's stagnation dressed in comfort. Nietzsche's rebellion begins with the death of false gods, the illusions you worship to keep fear at bay. Social approval, predictable routines, the myth of a fixed identity, the illusion that tomorrow will look like today if you just follow the rules. These are the lies that keep you small. He called for a revaluation of all values, a radical inversion of what society teaches us to seek, strength instead of obedience, creativity instead of conformity, becoming instead of belonging. To live without fear, you must be willing to destroy the scaffolding of the person you were told to be. You must, as Nietzsche wrote, become who you are. But how? Step 1. Face your abyss. Not metaphorically, actually, tangibly, consciously. That fear you've been running from, name it. Not just failure or rejection. Go deeper. I fear being seen and judged because I was mocked as a child. I fear speaking the truth because I watched my parents explode at honesty. I fear loneliness, not because I love others, but because I've never learned to love myself. This is not weakness. This is power. As Carl Jung said, that which we do not bring to consciousness appears in our lives as fate. The rebellion begins with shadow work, the courageous act of turning inward to face the disowned, denied, repressed parts of yourself. You can't break free from fear if you're not willing to sit in its presence without flinching. Step 2. Rewrite the myth. Fear thrives on story, on narrative. You're not just afraid of public speaking. You've told yourself the story that one mistake means humiliation. You're not just afraid of quitting your job. You've written the script where failure equals unworthiness. But what if you rewrote it? What if, as Viktor Frankl suggested, meaning is not found, but made? What if fear was no longer an enemy but a signal, a signpost that you're on the edge of transformation, a compass that points not to danger, but to destiny? This is what Nietzsche meant when he called for the Übermensch, not a superior being, but a transcendent one, someone who creates their values, who uses fear as fuel, who lives not reactively, but authentically. The Übermensch says, yes, I am afraid, and still, I go forward. Step 3. Seek discomfort deliberately. Courage is not born in comfort. It's built through voluntary suffering, through choosing challenge over ease, truth over approval, growth over predictability. Nietzsche himself lived this. He suffered deeply, chronically, spiritually, but he turned that suffering into art, into truth, into a philosophy that still burns through history. Suffering, when chosen, becomes sacred. You don't need to climb mountains or survive tragedies to live without fear. You need to start with the micro-rebellions, the 5 seconds of bravery, the difficult conversation, the unsent text finally sent, the truth finally spoken, the dream finally admitted out loud. Each act is a spark, enough sparks, and you start a fire. Step 4. Embrace solitude. Society breeds fear through noise, endless opinions, endless comparison, endless distraction. But solitude, that's where the voice returns. Your voice, the one drowned out for years by fear's megaphone. Nietzsche warned against the herd mentality for this very reason. To live without fear, you must be willing to walk alone, not because you hate others, but because you finally trust yourself. Solitude is the forge of selfhood. In silence, you hear the whispers of your real desires, the ones no algorithm can predict, the ones no role model can embody, the ones no validation can replace. And it's in that solitude that the fear starts to shift. It doesn't disappear, but it stops controlling you. It becomes a companion, not a captor, a test, not a sentence. And slowly, you begin to notice. Your world expands. You say what you mean. You do what you fear. You stop asking for permission. You begin to live, not reactively, not apologetically, but rebelliously, authentically, fearlessly. And that, Nietzsche would argue, is when life truly begins. Because what we call fearlessness isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision that fear is no longer king, and that rebellion, it ends with a transformation so total, so real, that the person you become will look back at the one you were and whisper, "You were brave enough to burn it all down. You thought fear was the enemy, that if you could kill it, silence it, outrun it, you'd finally be free." But imagine this. You are standing at the summit of a vast, empty world. The wind howls. The sky stretches endlessly in every direction, blank and cold. You have conquered every obstacle. No more failures. No more uncertainty. No more pain. You are untouchable, invincible, safe. And yet, it feels hollow. You're not free. You're alone with your triumph. And it tastes like ash. Because here is Nietzsche's final revelation, his ultimate truth, buried not in triumph, but in tragedy. Fear is not your prison. Fear is your invitation. The goal was never to eliminate fear. That's the lie you were sold. The truth is far more dangerous and far more liberating. To live without fear is not to be fearless. It is to be so radically alive, so unshakably rooted in your own becoming, that fear becomes a companion instead of a captor, a necessary darkness that sharpens the light. Nietzsche's greatest insight wasn't about power. It was about becoming. That life's deepest meaning is not handed down from above. It is not guaranteed, not secure, not safe. It is forged through suffering, through uncertainty, through the crucible of your own fear. This is Amor Fati, the love of one's fate, not just acceptance. Not even endurance. Love, to look at everything that has scarred you, broken you, haunted you, and say, "This, too, is mine. This, too, has made me." Can you do that? Can you love the thing that almost destroyed you? Can you embrace the fall, knowing it shaped the wings? This is not a comfort philosophy. This is not pop spirituality. This is fire and blood. It's the understanding that life is not supposed to be easy. And that's what makes it worth living. You don't become fearless by avoiding fear. You become fearless by becoming someone that fear cannot dominate. Someone who dances on the edge of chaos, because that's where creativity lives. Someone who risks rejection, because their truth is louder than their need to belong. Someone who walks into the abyss not because they're unafraid, but because they've learned to see in the dark. Do you know what Nietzsche feared most? Not pain, not failure, stagnation, the slow rot of comfort, the mediocrity of the last man, the one who seeks only pleasure, avoids discomfort, and loses the ability to aspire, to become, to burn. That's the real tragedy. To never truly live because you were too afraid to suffer. So Nietzsche dares you to look in the mirror and ask, are you becoming? Or are you decaying? Because the true rebellion is not against fear, it's against the self that fear has built, the domesticated version of you that plays small, stays quiet, and dies slowly in exchange for approval. You are not here to be safe. You are here to become dangerous to everything that numbs you, deceives you, and holds you back. Not violent, not cruel, but dangerous in your clarity, your depth, your refusal to live an unlived life. Dangerous in your authenticity. That's the new definition of fearlessness. Not an adrenaline rush, not recklessness, but the quiet, steady power of someone who has nothing left to prove. Because They have already chosen themselves. This is what Nietzsche meant by becoming the Übermensch, not a god, not a tyrant, but a human who has outgrown their fear-soaked skin, a human who has died to the shallow life and been reborn into the deep. You're not looking for safety anymore. You're looking for truth, even if it burns, even if it breaks you first, because on the other side of fear, beyond the walls you built and the lies you swallowed, is the only freedom that's ever been real. The freedom to become who you were always meant to be, no matter the cost. So, here is Nietzsche's secret. Not a tactic, not a strategy, but a truth. You will always feel fear. But once you stop running from it, once you stop treating it as the enemy, it transforms. It becomes a gate, and when you walk through it, you don't find the absence of fear. You find yourself. And that finally, deeply, is what it means to live without fear. Not that fear is gone, but that you are no longer